Thank you very much for inviting me, and I apologize, these slides, some of them are going to be very hard to see because they're used to being projected in a darker room than this, but I'll just try to tell you what's actually shown right here. There is a female evening grosbeak. You can see this big beak right there, and here's a male. You can see the yellow eye stripe, and there's his beak. And the white in his wings, so I'll try to point things out if these things are just completely invisible. So I am going to talk about evening grosbeaks tonight, and they are finches, so I'm actually going to start by just saying a little bit about what a finch is, because a lot of people are kind of confused by what finches are. And so what is a finch? There's a few different species that or a few different families that qualify as finches. This is a house sparrow, which you would be able to see if it was a little darker. That family is the Plosiids. Those are considered finches. And there are also, those are zebra finches, which a photograph I took as a kid when I had them in an aviary myself. The Astrilidids, those are wax-billed finches. Those are also finches. And then there's another family. The Emberizids are a whole bunch of different kinds of finches. The Carduelinae finches, this is, you probably can't tell, but it's a black-headed grosbeak. Those are finches. And also it's confusing because they're called grosbeaks, but they're unrelated to evening grosbeaks and pine grosbeaks, totally different family. So the common names can get a little bit confusing. And then the fringillid finches. This thing here is a chaffinch. And we're going to focus on the fringillids because that's what evening grosbeaks are, is fringillids. There are subfamilies within this group. And the Latin names, the families end in IDAE for animals. And the subfamilies are INAE, so these fringillines are birds like the brambling and the chaffinch, shown here. And then there's euphonias, these cool little neotropical finches that are pretty neat little birds. And then the Carduelinae finches are the ones that we're really going to focus on. Here's an evening grosbeak, and you almost can even tell that's what it is in this picture. Maybe by the end of the talk, the sun will have set a little bit. This is a pine siskin. This is a Cassin's finch. This is an eevee. If you've been to Hawaii, these are derived from a colonizing Carduelinae finch a number of millions of years ago. So the Hawaiian honey creepers used to be in their own family, but they are considered Carduelinae finches now. So we've got a bunch of different Western Carduelinae finches, and they're super fascinating birds, even though they're sort of the kind of most mundane. All of them are kind of, have these little blocky beaks, short tails. The plumage is often not super spectacular, but they have a lot of fascinating features. We'll talk about evening grosbeaks up there, but gray-crowned rosy-finches, red poles, that's a pine grosbeak right there, red crossbills and white-winged crossbills, goldfinches like the lesser goldfinch, Cassin's finches, pine siskins. These are all the common Western Carduelinae finches. And I got interested in finches back when I was in graduate school in the late 1980s. And I was studying crossbills. See if we can see this. This is hard to see too, but we've got the crossed mandibles of this one happens to be a type 5 red crossbill up in Wyoming, a young male. And I was interested in crossbills specifically because they have this unusual reproductive schedule, and that's what I was studying was how they regulate their annual cycles of reproduction and molt and migration. Crossbills, as you may or may not know, have been reputed to nest in any month. This actually turns out to be pretty close to nonsense, but it's all through the literature. And actually, what is definitely the case, though, is that they can breed in the summer, they can breed in the winter. We just were studying a breeding population up around Sisters, Oregon this past winter, and the nests, they began nesting in January, and they nested right through April and even into May. So that's pretty common, and they had been nesting the previous summer. So they were a fascinating bird to study. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. What I wanted to do was use the crossbill as sort of a springboard for one of the things that we are going to focus on tonight, which is vocal types, call types within the finches. And crossbills are sort of the poster child for that. Many of you may be familiar with the fact that there are 12 currently known North American crossbill vocal types, one of which, type 9, has been split off as the cassia crossbill. These live in southern Idaho. And the others are still just considered types. Precisely what to call them, cryptic species or whatever, is still up for debate. But it was when I was in graduate school that I became aware of these crossbill call types. And initially it was just confusing to me because I was noticing this when I started doing field work in Washington, that I had what seemed to be 4 different vocal types. And then I met Jeff Groth at UC Berkeley, and turned out he was working on these birds. And in later, just the same year that I met him, actually, his first paper on this came out. You can see he calls crossbill types cryptic species here. And he, in this paper, in the Condor in 1988, he described the first 2 of the types that he discovered. And they were types 1 and 2. And they were from the Appalachians. And he, at the time, was working on describing another 6 types that I found out about from him, and 4 of which corresponded to the ones that I had already been finding in Washington. So he published a big monograph in 1993 on all those 8 types. There is now an additional 4 that have been found, so that we have 12. It's getting nuts, but it's also pretty interesting. So one of the reasons Jeff Groth was interested in these crossbills, and what led him to discover these types, was that there's huge variation in the size of these things. So I know these drawings may not look conspicuously different, but the one on the right really is big. Look at its beak, is much heavier than the little stubby one on the left there. And there actually is one form that's even bigger. There are 4 size classes of red crossbills known in North America. And within each of those size classes, there are usually 2 or more different vocal types. And these vocal types correspond to probably breeding populations. It's tempting to call them subspecies, but that term specifically refers to geographically defined variants, like white-crowned sparrows, where we have 5 subspecies of white-crowned sparrows. Those are geographically distinct in the breeding season. And crossbills are just not. They can be overlapping. You can have 4 or 5 different types breeding in the same location at the same time. So it gets really confusing.
Do they breed?
Do they interbreed?
Yeah.
Very rarely. Mostly they breed true to type. Yeah, and they are genetically distinct, though not as distinct as most people who would call them species would like them to be. So, right, so but they often are using the same resources. So we had lots. It was a ponderosa pine cone crop in the Sisters area in Oregon this past winter, and we had lots of medium and big birds. Type 2 and type 4 were the 2 call types that were prevalent there. And there were some type 5s and some type 3s. There were 4 types at least there, and 2 of them very common. So it's really confusing, but it's also exciting and interesting to study them.
I want to ask a question.
Yeah.
Is that just by chance that the small bill is shown crossing differently than the medium? And
Yes.
okay.
It's half and that's a good question. Half and half in each of these types basically go left and right. Yeah, and it's the top bill is straight, and the lower one curves either to the left or to the right. Yeah, and I'd be happy to come back sometime and talk more about crossbills. I love talking about crossbills, but they're, and actually you have some. I saw quite a few type 2s, which are big, one of the big types, just up 20 at the White Cloud campground a week or two ago. And they had fledglings, so I think they've been breeding around here too. Yes?
Are you going to mention, I assume the big crossbills then eat the ponderosa pine seeds and so forth?
Well, so they actually, right, so this is a topic for a whole talk, but actually the biggest ones, Matt Young of the Finch Research Network, he calls them the eat everything crossbill. So eBird would have you believe that type 2s are just ponderosa pine crossbills. And yes, you'll find type 2s in swarms on ponderosa pine, but they're in all kinds of habitats. In the Sierra, they're in lodgepole pine, they're in Jeffrey pine, they're in even pinyon pine some, and also ponderosa pine. And I've also found them breeding in Douglas fir and in spruce. So take the thing about the names with a grain of salt, but definitely if you are looking for a swarm of type 2s, it would probably be wise to go look in a ponderosa forest that's got a lot of cones, and you'll probably find a lot of type 2s there. But you might find a lot of type 4s and 5s there too. So it's much more confusing than those names would lead us to believe, I think. Anyway, the main thing I wanted to do is just say this kind of steeped me learning about all these types and having to identify them in the field, because you can learn to tell these apart by ear if you need good hearing, you need good audio discrimination, you need good auditory memory to do it, but lots and lots of bird watchers can tell these things apart by their vocalizations. And these 4, let's see if this works. No. Nope. Okay. These 4 were the common ones that I was experiencing in Washington in just the first year I started studying crossbills, which was 1987-88 as a Ph.D. student. Types 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you can see from this, these are data from Jeff Groth's dissertation, that types 2 and 5 are almost identical in size, but they have super different calls. These are these really kind of ringing doubled notes. It's actually probably using both sides of the syrinx simultaneously to make that sound. Type 2 is a very mellow dropping chup. Type 3 are really little, and they have a really burry little note that goes like a backwards N. It's very, if you slow it down, it kind of goes boo-woo. And then type 4 is medium size, and that drops, boo-whoop, goes up, but much faster than that, obviously. So one of the things that after studying crossbills for a while that I was curious about was, are the other Carduelinae finches prone to having these call types? So what about pine siskins? Here's a pine siskin in Wyoming. And oops, for some reason, every time I show that particular slide, the thing decides it's just going to go to the next slide. Pine siskins are widespread, as you know, and there's no evidence at all that there are any different call types in pine siskins. And that's true of a number of the Carduelinaes, that we have no evidence yet. That doesn't mean, no evidence is not the same as there are no call types. But people have looked in redpolls, in pine siskins, in American goldfinches, things like that, and not found it yet.
What makes any of these groups, I mean, really, what makes a finch a finch?
Well, so in general, the conical bill is one of the main things, but a lot of them are basically genetically related. So there's morphological characteristics and genetic characteristics. But yeah, I mean, I can give a whole talk on finches. I want to get on to the evening grosbeaks here. But it's a good question, because some of the things that look like finches, if you see a female brown-headed cowbird, you may very well think it's a finch, but it's actually a blackbird, totally different family. So a lot of this has to do with genetics, is the genetic relatedness, and a lot of the morphological similarities come from convergent evolution in certain cases. So as I was doing all this field work on crossbills, I had a lot of experience with evening grosbeaks. In Washington, in particular, they were common at some of my field sites, and I got super familiar with their calls. And it was later on that I moved in there. You can sort of see that's a female evening grosbeak. It's getting a little darker in here. She's doing a thing that's really common in evening grosbeaks. This is in Wyoming, and she's eating a serviceberry fruit, but she's getting rid of the fruit and eating the pit. That's what evening grosbeaks do a lot of. So choke cherry and serviceberry, probably bitter cherry in the Sierra. They're eating the seed, not the fruit. When I started working in the Sierra Nevada a lot back in the mid-1990s, I was spending a bunch of time over around Truckee because my wife's family had a condominium at the North Star ski area since the 1970s, and so we'd go hang out there. And there were evening grosbeaks all over the place. But it struck me immediately that they didn't sound like the ones that I was used to in Washington. But there was nothing at all in the literature about this, and I had never spoken to anybody who had referred to evening grosbeaks as having vocal types. The thing that I started doing at that point was just when I would make notes about evening grosbeaks, I just started referring to them as types 1 and 2. If I heard one that sounded like the ones that I was used to up in Washington, that was type 1. And if I heard ones that sounded like the ones I had heard around Truckee, then I was just calling those type 2. And I was not really doing anything very much about this at that time, just sort of keeping field notes about finches, which I was prone to doing. And then one year, 1999, I was actually going to Colorado with one of my grad students, Rod Kelsey. We were looking for crossbills, and we're going up into the wet mountains near the town of, I'm told it's pronounced locally Pueblo, not Pueblo. And so we were in the wet mountains near Pueblo, and we were driving up one of these Forest Service roads and went past one of the last houses before it just turned into wildland, and they had a feeder, and there were a bunch of evening grosbeaks at it. We had the windows down in the truck, and we hear all these things calling, and I looked at Rod and said, that doesn't sound like any evening grosbeak I've ever heard. And so we caught some, we were misnetting, and recorded a bunch of them, and sort of squirreled this away as something pretty interesting. Then a couple years later, after I moved to Davis, I was talking to a couple of my grad students, including Rod Kelsey, who had been with me in the wet mountains, and another grad student, Kendra Sewell, and I just said, we need to follow up on this and see if there's anything that we can do to actually look more closely at these different call types, because it seemed like we had 3 different call types, but we didn't really know that much about evening grosbeaks. So to follow up on it, first of all, one of the things that we found was that Joseph Grinnell had written a paper back in 1917 where he defined 5 subspecies of evening grosbeaks. And one was from the Pacific Northwest. One was from practically endemic to the Sierra, according to his map. Or he didn't draw a map, but his description. And then one was just in the southern Rocky Mountains, and then one in the kind of northeast and Midwest, and one essentially in Mexico, extreme southern Arizona and Mexico. So he defined 5 of these things. And so what Kendra and Rod did was, this is way before the time of eBird and lots of readily available digital recordings. They went and got a bunch of recordings from Cornell. So Cornell was archiving lots of recordings still then or already, as well as from the Borer Lab of Bioacoustics at Ohio State. And they put together a collection of recordings, and we looked at those spectrograms from those and listened to them and concluded that there were 4 call types in that set of stuff combined with our own recordings. And so they put together a paper on this, which this is the title of that, that we published in the Condor. And here are the 4 different call types that we identified, plus 1, okay, which I'll just say a little bit about, but we still don't know very much about this number 5 one. So number 1 here is so spectrograms, if you're not used to reading those, it's frequency or pitch on the y-axis and it's time on the x-axis. And these are all less than a second long. They're like not even a half second long. And that first one, type 1, is what the spectrograms look like for the ones from the Northwest that I was familiar with as a graduate student. The second one is what a typical spectrogram looks like for the ones from around Truckee, and turns out in the Sierra generally. The third one is one that they discovered when they got these recordings from Cornell and the Borer Lab at Ohio State, type 3. And those, as I'll show you in a minute, turn out to come pretty much exclusively from the Midwest and Northeast. And then the fourth one here, that's the type that Rod and I encountered in the wet mountains in Colorado. And then this thing, we only had a single exemplar, a single recording from a guy named Rich Hoyer, who sent us this thing from, I think it was the Huachuca or the Chiricahua Mountains in southern Arizona. And that one still is enigmatic. But for sure, these first 4 seemed like they were good vocal types, kind of like what we were learning was the case with the crossbills. Okay, so I just want to mention one other thing about the methods used here. We didn't just identify these ourselves and then try to kind of shoehorn them into Grinnell's 5 subspecies thing. One of the things that Kendra did was she made basically little flashcard decks out of a bunch of these spectrograms. And so there were replicate ones of different individuals from each of these types. And they made this stack of these, this is like really old school, hard copy little flashcard things, shuffled them up and gave them to several people who knew how to read spectrograms but didn't know what this was even about. And the only instruction she gave them was sort these into as few or as many categories as you like. That was it. And they sorted them exactly the way we did. So there's things you can do with computers and everything that achieve the same thing, but actually humans are really good at categorizing things, and they came up with the same categories we did. Actually, one of the people lumped 2 and 4 and said these were the same, but then they said if I was going to split them further, I'd split them into these. So they basically said the same thing as the other people. So I thought that was a cool way to do that. And these are just some examples from that paper so type 1s, you can see there's some from Montana, Washington, California, Colorado, Idaho, British Columbia. They're all over the place in the West. Type 2, all of the recordings we had at the time were from California. We now know they're quite common up in southern Oregon, and I'll show you some more about that in a few minutes. Type 3, all of those were from the East and Midwest. And type 4, we were the only ones that had anything on those, and those were from Colorado, but we've also found those to be common sometimes in Wyoming. And that's turning out to be pretty consistent. Type 5, again, we just put it in there because we had this one recording, but it was 1, so it could just be a weirdo, right? It doesn't have to be correspond to anything. And then here Kendra made a map that basically shows where our recordings came from and how they relate to where Grinnell said these subspecies should be. And basically the take home is here there's lots of the type 1s up where this northwestern one, CV brooksii, Cocothrostes vespertinus brooksii, up in the northwest. But type 1s are also, in our sample, were pretty common in California, the black dots. Type 2 were almost all down in California. At the time, I had observed one up by Mount Adams in Washington once. But pretty much they were, the only place we had encountered them was in California. We didn't have a lot of data from type 4, but the ones we had were all down in Colorado, except for a few up in Wyoming. And then all of the ones from the east were type 3. And then, of course, we don't know what's going on with type 5 because there's hardly any data. Go to Mexico and make recordings, please. Yes?
Grinnell's recordings were...
He didn't have recordings. This is totally plumage and morphology.
Wow.
Okay? He wasn't saying they were types. He was saying they were subspecies. Totally based on morphology and plumage. Okay, sorry, I didn't make that clear. Nobody had looked at recordings of vocal behavior of these before.
Still, Grinnell, to have picked
Yeah.
that up among all the other things that he documented.
Oh,
What a brain.
totally. The old ornithologists actually really were paying attention and were really good at discriminating fine stuff. It's not unusual at all. So actually, I didn't tell you. The AOU, the American Ornithologists Union, in 1957, lumped these three subspecies. And it wasn't until we found that there were these 3 vocal types that people started thinking there might really be 3 subspecies there. Again, I think Grinnell was right, and the American Ornithologists Union said no in 57. It stayed that way ever since. Yes?
Does environment affect the song that's doing?
Does environment affect the vocal behavior?
Does a group all generally learn the same song? And so it's affected by where they're living?
So the question is, do they all learn the same? I'm going to correct it to call, because these are calls, not songs. I'm going to digress also for a second here. The dogma has always been that calls, like these flight calls, are innate, okay, in all kinds of birds. They're innate, meaning you could deafen the bird, or you could tutor it with sounds from another species or from whatever, and they're still going to develop the same vocal behavior. Cardueline finches are the first group in which it was demonstrated that calls, as opposed to just song is like the breeding and territorial behavior, well known to have learned components in many, many kinds of songbirds. But Cardueline finches were the first to be shown to actually learn elements of their vocal repertoire other than song. And they probably are learning the details of these flight calls from their parents. It has not been shown definitively in evening grosbeaks, but Kendra Sewell, the same student who wrote this paper, she actually did some very clear experiments with crossbills that show that they learn, the baby crossbills learn the flight call type of their parents or their foster parents if they're cross-fostered to a different type. Does that answer your question pretty much? So you're wondering about are these things like biological features of these birds, or are they just learned?
It doesn't sound like it. It sounds like it's a learned experience.
It is a learned behavior, but it still can be indicative of a genetic group. If they choose mates based on those calls and they learn those calls from their parents, which typically they do. There's a huge literature on cultural evolution and its importance in the genetic evolutionary process too. So, but it's a great question.
Well, what you said then, does that mean a baby bird can know some of the calls through genetics and not learning it from the parents?
So it has not been, the question there is, can they know some aspects of the calls through genetics without learning from the parents? That has not been studied in calls. It's definitely been studied in song. And this is like a topic for a whole additional seminar or whatever. people often say that bird song is learned, but it's actually a combination of innate predispositions and experience dependence or learning. And lots of species are prone to learn things that are typical for their species. And it's a very difficult task to get them to learn the songs or calls of a different species. That said, I would wager if you did experiments, cross-fostering experiments with baby evening grosbeaks and tutored them with, it's important that it be live tutors actually, they need to get social input here. If they are tutored by a different call type, I would predict that they would grow up giving the foster parents calls. And then all bets are off as to who they're going to choose as a mate and so forth. There's a bunch of work that's been done on this in parrots, where sorry, I digress easily, but this is kind of cool. There's birds called galahs and also sulfur-crested cockatoos. And galahs this is in Australia, galahs will start nesting in a cavity in a tree, and then sulfur-crested ones will come in and kick them out, but there'll already be eggs in there. And the baby galahs hatch eventually and then get raised with a brood of sulfur-crested cockatoos, and they grow up giving the cockatoo calls. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here, but the behavior is probably learned predominantly. They actually, if you don't tutor them at all, they'll still give flight calls, but they'll probably be some kind of weird structure that's not naturally occurring anywhere. That's what happens with crossbills. Yes?
So basically you're saying that the song is innate and the call is learned.
So no, I'm actually saying, so first of all, evening grosbeaks are weird. I'm going to play you a song of an evening grosbeak here. And I'm doing it, this is really low tech. This is just with my phone. Just listen to this for a minute. Hold on. Not terribly complicated. So it's actually just using flight calls with some trills. I'll say something about trills in a second. And that's the dawn song, as far as we know, for an evening grosbeak. And it's just a combination of some of its other vocal behavior that it puts together in a particular way. Most species of songbirds, the song has very definitive learned components, and only in basically Cardueline finches and chickadees has it been shown definitively that calls are learned. Songs are like sexual and territorial and complicated. Calls, there's a whole repertoire. When people use the term call, they're referring to a bunch of things. There's alarm calls and contact calls and food calls and other kinds of social calls. Crossbills have a terrifically complicated vocal repertoire, and so do evening grosbeaks. You just can't hear most of it because it's so soft. They're talking just very locally to each other. Yeah, so I mean, these are all great questions, not all super easy to answer definitively. Let's see, where are we? We're getting way behind. That always happens to me, but that's okay. It's good. I like questions as long as you're willing to sit here for a while. So anyway, this is Kendra's map. Here's a little bit cleaner, easier to read map that shows type 2, our Sierra birds, seem to be, have a really limited range here, that they probably go up a little farther than this shows. Type 1 has an extensive northwestern range. Type 4 seems to be prevalent in the southern Rockies. Type 5 we still don't know very much about. There's a little bit speculative here. And then type 3 are really prevalent in the east. This area here just needs more study, but there's actually some evidence that there might be a sixth call type hidden there in that part of the country that we don't know about and that Grinnell didn't suspect either. So that's where we were as of 2004 when we published that little paper that described these 4 mainly call types and said maybe there's a type 5. And we just allude to the fact that this corresponds pretty nicely to Grinnell's 5 subspecies and let it go at that. What's happened since then? Well, here's a paper. Doug Robinson is a professor at Oregon State University, and he and some of his students have done a bunch of work on evening grosbeaks. And this paper was published in 2024, and they talk about using these flight calls as well as the trills, which were in that recording that I just played for you. They went cheer and then kind of brrr, cheer, brrr. So those trills are these things that all the evening grosbeaks do too. And one of the things that they pointed out and that I want to highlight is that the number of recordings that have become available for people to use for research have skyrocketed recently. So here's when our paper was published back in 2004. 2016 is when eBird made it possible for people to easily upload audio files instead of just photographs with their sightings and or observations. And you can see the number of evening grosbeak recordings just skyrocketed after that. And Doug Robinson and his students have been taking advantage of this. For one thing, they got tons of recordings from Cornell that way, and they were able to look more carefully at the flight calls. So there's type 1 and 2 flight calls in the top row. And then here are the trills down below, those prrr things that they do. And actually what they found was these tend to have more wobbles in them. The trill is faster and longer and has more wobbles in type 2s than in type 1s. And those can also be used to distinguish the two types. So that's cool. It's not as clear when they go try to look at type 4 and 3. Those are not as easily distinguished based on trills, but the flight calls are super distinctive. And then using these recordings that are available in large quantities from Cornell now, Will Kirsch, one of Doug Robinson's graduate students, not graduate students, I keep calling him that because he's really good, he's an undergrad who just finished his senior thesis. What he was able to do was extend what we were looking at with just a handful of recordings that we got back in the early 2000s by using many, many dozens of recordings that he got. And what he found was during the breeding season, May through August, type 1s were almost all, he was only looking at Oregon and California for this. Okay, type 1s occur much more widely than this, but he was really interested in the sort of range boundary, if it exists, between the two. And so he was just looking at Oregon and California, and you can see there's a few records, mostly in May down in the Sierra. Here's one in July. There's always a few type 1s in the Sierra, but most of them in the breeding season are up in Oregon. Whereas type 2s, which are the ones that I heard back in 1996 or whatever at North Star, they're super prevalent all through the Sierra, especially kind of the central northern Sierra. They're not as common down to the south, but there's probably also fewer eBird recordings from down there. There's good access to places up here, and it's less obvious down here, but there are also just maybe fewer grosbeaks down there. And then up into southern Oregon, and then as you get further north in Oregon, based on these recordings that he got from Cornell, you start to have a rapid tapering off of type 2s. So what it looks like is there's sort of an overlap zone there just north of the California border, California-Oregon border. Okay, so that's something that is available because bird watchers are uploading tons of recordings to eBird, and these audio samples, notice they're not actually data. We're not relying on the bird watcher to have identified the type. Will Kirsch did that. He just needed the sample, and there's tons of these samples out there. It's a super valuable thing that bird watchers are providing to help clarify range distributions of these birds. Okay, there's other technological advances that have been being made, and this includes audio recording, automated audio recording units, ARUs. These are two different types, and back in 2021, Matt Young from the Finch Research Network and Cornell, he got me 8 of these Swift ARUs, these things, And we deployed these things in a transect from the northern Sierra up to middle of Oregon on the east slope of the Cascades. And I'll tell you some more about those things because Will Kirsch also used the recordings that we got from these for part of his senior thesis. And then there's fancier new ones that you can just talk to with your phone, like these wildlife acoustics ones here that we have some of, with having used some of the money that we got from Sierra Foothills Audubon to study these birds. And I'll show you some more about that a little later. We don't have data from those yet, but we have them out in some transects. So these things, they're basically a recorder that's got a chip or an audio or a digital memory card in them and batteries, and you just program them to record on a particular schedule. The Swift ones are a big pain to do, actually. You got to plug them in to your laptop. You have to first unscrew this top. You have to plug it into your laptop via a special cable, and it's got to be a Windows machine, and it's got to be ready to go basically before you take it out into the field. And it also doesn't keep track of like latitude and longitude, so you just put in fixed times and it will start recording at 4 a.m. every time or whatever you tell it to do. These little things actually are much smarter than that, and you can tell them start X minutes or hours before sunrise at the location that you have it programmed to be. So they'll track seasonal changes. You won't get these hours of recordings in the dark or whatever before your birds are up. These are great, and you talk to them with your phone by Bluetooth. So they're super handy little things. So you get it, but okay, these things, you generate an enormous amount of audio samples from these things. And we had a bunch of these things deployed on a transect. So this is a little bit complicated. I discovered when I downloaded this that it was a file out in, I think it must have been in Google Earth or something that Will had updated with new things. So it's got a bunch of additional recording sites. I'm just going to tell you what some of them were. This one is at the Cedars in the North Fork of the American River. And I just wanted Ted Beatty was the one who got me started doing this. He was encouraging me really strongly to follow up on the things that we had originally discovered. And he had said, there's just tons of evening grosbeaks all the time around the Cedars up there, and we really should study them some more. So he encouraged me to come put one of these up there. I just wanted to say I only found out he had passed away just like less than a week ago. I was at the Mono Basin Bird Chautauqua and expecting to see him. And so anyway, it's upsetting. But anyway, Ted was wonderful, and he was an inspiration for a lot of the work that we're trying to do on these birds. And he got us started putting one of these at the Cedars. Which turns out to be one of the hot spots, as he predicted it would be. It's one of these carbonate springs, which Ted felt was one of the things that really attracted evening grosbeaks. Going back to when he was doing his dissertation at UC Davis decades ago. Then this is up at, I don't know if any of you have ever been to, what's the name of this place? Domingo Springs. On the North Fork of the Feather River, another place where you get these carbonate springs, and there's just scads of evening grosbeaks. So in 2021, I'm dating myself when I start saying 19 this and 19 that. 2021, we put one there. That one, we didn't get any data that year because it burned. But it didn't burn the habitat so badly that we couldn't put one there in subsequent years. This is up at Trout Creek near southeast of Mount Shasta, another really good place for evening grosbeaks. And then we've got some others up further north. This one was added in a subsequent year because we were getting really interested in this area. And these are ones that Will and Doug Robinson added because they were super interested in what's happening right there north of the California-Oregon border. And then we had one at Crater Lake. There's up there. And then there's two more on the far right up there. One of them is at a place called Odell Butte. And one of them is, the farthest north one is at the Metolius River in Oregon. And so basically we had this arcing transect. And what we then had, though, was thousands of hours of these recordings. So what do you do with that? Well, so on the one hand, you've got great samples, but you don't have any data from those samples yet. So what Will did, I just want to tell you a little bit about what you can do with these things. So Cornell has some software stuff that can help with this. So there's a thing called Raven that you can either pay for it, get Raven Pro, or you guys can get Raven Lite for free, and it'll do anything you probably need it to do. And so one thing you can do with Raven is you can take your audio samples, feed them into it, and produce those spectrograms. So you put in your 1 hour clip, and you spread the time scale out so you can actually see the spectrograms in a form that's readable. And then you just visually scan through it, just scroll through it with your mouse. And you could look for evening grosbeak calls in that. That's one thing you could do. That's also very tedious and slow, and if it's a poor, faint recording, you're probably not going to be able to see it on there. So that's not perfect, but Raven is still super valuable, and I encourage you, if you like playing with sounds and want to learn how to identify birds by sounds, get a copy of Raven, use your phone to make recordings, and put the recordings in there and fiddle around with them. One of the best things you can do with Raven, this is another digression, by the way, if it wasn't evident, is you can slow the sounds down, okay? And actually, I meant to play these for you. I'm going to go back a few slides and just play these things. We didn't get the audio working right. It's my fault. But I'm going to play some of these. Here's a type 1 at full speed. Let me see if I can make that louder. Cheer. It sounds like cheer, right? Here it is slowed down to half speed. Okay, and here's type 2 at full speed. It also sounds like cheer, right? At full speed. Here it is slowed down. So here's type 1. It dwells right there. You're not able to see what I'm pointing at. But, oh, actually, yeah, now you can. That dwell, that level thing, is what really distinguishes type 1. It drops, and then it is level, and then it drops again. And type 2 just starts high, rises, fades, and then drops again. So you can slow stuff down in Raven and listen to that stuff. And it's much easier to tell what you're supposed to be listening for. It's how the bird pronounces the sound is what you're listening for. And it's much easier to recognize that when you're looking at these, dealing with these slowed down sounds. So get Raven and fiddle around with it. It's really fun. Okay, so that's one thing, is Raven can be helpful. But then they also have a thing called BirdNet, which is so BirdNet is the researcher's version of Merlin. And so what it does is it's trained to identify bird sounds. So it can identify evening grosbeaks. It doesn't know the types apart yet, anyway, but it can tell when it thinks it knows there's an evening grosbeak. So you can feed sounds into it, like your 1 hour clips from your automated recording unit, and you can ask it, tell me whether there are things in there that you think are evening grosbeaks, and where are they in that recording. And then you can go through and quickly check all those and see which ones are just not evening grosbeaks, and which ones are type 1, which ones are type 2, or whatever. So this is just a screenshot. Yeah, and you can see this now. I don't know why this wasn't showing up before. This is a screenshot from Raven, and this is not an evening grosbeak recording. It's actually a black phoebe recording, which I understand is the name of your newsletter. Is that right, the Phoebe or something? Cool. And what you can, oh, there it is. What you can see here is you can choose this thing called a learning detector. So the learning detector, again, unfortunately, you have to do this on a PC. It only works on a Windows machine for some reason. But with the learning detector, you can tell it, I want you to tell me, using BirdNet, where in this recording is whatever you're asking for, evening grosbeak, let's say. And what it does then is it highlights every one, you process the sound, takes a minute or so to process an hour of sound, and then it puts little boxes around everything that it thinks is an evening grosbeak, and it makes a little table down here that you can just scroll down, and then it'll toggle you from one to the next of all these things that it identified, and then you can just look at those and listen to them yourself and decide what they are. And you go, the first one, nope, that was a Cassin's vireo going, and it wasn't an evening grosbeak. And no, the next one, yep, that was a type 1 evening grosbeak, and the next one was a type 2, and in this one there's type 1 and 2 together. So that is what this does, and that's what Will Kirsch did, was he went through a whole bunch of the recordings that we made with those automated recording units along that transect, including the ones that they put out, that he and Doug Robinson put out. And here's the figure that he made from this. And here we are down at Soda Springs. So this is hard to read, I realize, but this is the proportion of the audio clips that he listened to that actually had the type. Okay, so this is type 1, 2, or both together in the same little clip, same little tiny piece of the clip, actually. And what you can see here, almost 60%, that's 0.6 there, almost 60% were showing up as having type 2s at Soda Springs. Ted Beatty was absolutely right. There's a lot of evening grosbeaks there. But a few of them were type 1s, not very many, mostly type 2s. So this is down in the Central Sierra. Here's Domingo Springs, that other place I told you up in the Feather River country. Still a lot of type 2s, very few type 1s. And then when we get up to Trout Creek, still a lot of type 2s, not as many in either case as there were at Soda Springs or the Cedars, but we're starting to get more type 1s here up at Trout Creek near Mount Shasta. And then it really starts to shift when we get north of the California-Oregon border. When we get up to Lake of the Woods, just north, here's the California-Oregon border here. You can see it's the first time that type 1s actually are more prevalent on these recordings than type 2s. And then when you get further, Crater Lake and Waldo Lake, type 1 is the predominant bird. So this was possible to do because we had automated recording units, and we had the ability to scan these things using fancy technology now that streamline this process and let us listen to a lot more of these recordings without having to go through it in real time. Yes?
Sorry if this is a little obvious, but is there any variation throughout that period, May through August? Is there any migration within that period?
It's not obvious at all. It's a great question. And the answer is that the question was, is there variation in like these prevalences, I think is what you're talking about, in those different months, by months May through August. And the short answer to that is Will didn't try to resolve it within that time interval, but he did start to look at later, and especially later. And one of the things that he found was that you start to see these type 2s like pouring up into Oregon more later in the season, for example. And one thing we know is that type 1s, much later in the season, in the fall and winter, can end up in large numbers down in California. So there are movement patterns, but this is like for the future. We haven't really worked those things out yet. And it's probably varying from year to year as well. Okay. So what are we doing with the recording units that we got recently using money that you guys awarded us? One of the things that is really interesting is to try to sort out, especially what's happening with the geographic distribution and habitat associations of type 2s specifically in the Sierra. And so we've started looking at that. This is going to be a multi-year project, but we've posted a bunch of these things out, and this is a little hard to see. It's much easier, of course, to see on my own screen. But we've got a northern transect of ARUs, a central transect, and a southern transect. These are all actually not very far apart. So this is the North Yuba up here. Okay, so that's basically along Highway 49 going from Goodyear Bar over to Satley, just over Yuba Pass. And just by the way, we had evening grosbeaks at these 3 sites while we were deploying them, including a type 1 right here at this campground, but mostly type 2s. This was like a couple weeks ago that we put these out. So these are supposed to get the breeding season, basically. And then we've got a transect that starts just east of here, starting at the White Cloud Campground. That's why we were over there looking for a place to deploy one of these things, and that's where we heard the type 2 crossbills with fledglings, was right in there. So going up along Highway 20 and then to 80, and one of the problems we have is that, of course, 80 is just horrendously noisy. And so you need to put these things in places where you're not just completely overwhelmed with either creek noise or wind. Wind is hard to predict, but some places are windier than others. And just like road noise is awful. So we actually had to hike to a few of the places, which is fine, except that when you're dealing with a lot of these things, it greatly increases the time it takes to deploy them and also to check them, replace memory cards or replace batteries. But we had to hike up the Loch Levin Trail a ways. I had never been up that. Has anybody hiked that? That is a kind of a horrendous trail. It was super cool. There were a lot of neat birds around there. We didn't hear any evening grosbeaks. But we got up far enough above the railroad track to a place where it was sort of protected and quiet. So we'll see what we get there. It's interesting habitat there. And then same at Castle Peak. We hiked north there to get away from 80. And then we have one at North Star, just on the balcony at the condominium that my father-in-law owns. And what's that? No horrendous hike. And there's that recording I played for you a little while ago came from right there. There's evening grosbeaks all the time there. Actually, not all the time, but every spring for sure. And then we have this one down along the Highway 50 corridor. Come on, where is that thing? Well, it's vanished and it's not showing up again, so I'll just come point to it here. Along the Highway 50 corridor, we have them going from this Newtown Road over here up past Bridal Veil, Wrights Lake Road. Many of you probably know there's a lot of burn country in this area now, so we were trying to find places that weren't just totally incinerated. And then over Echo Summit, and our last one is down in the Tahoe Basin along the road up to Fallen Leaf Lake, and we had type 2 evening grosbeaks there too. So we've got these 3 transects out, and we're going to see what happens with these. Each of these, so for example, there's habitat differences. Echo Summit is red fir and lodgepole, for example. Fallen Leaf Lake is Jeffrey pine and like incense cedar and white fir. That's the same as what's up at North Star, pretty much, is Jeffrey pine and white fir. And then Castle Peak, that's also red fir and lodgepole pine and some other stuff, western white pine. There's even some, right around where we put it, there's even some mountain hemlock there. And then same deal at Yuba Pass, lots of red fir, lodgepole pine. So we've got some level of replication of habitat type, and we're hoping that we'll find some interesting patterns here about where the birds are most prevalent. It's going to take multiple years of putting these things out to work this out, but I think probably what we're going to find is there aren't any of them down here at the lower elevations at this time of year. So in the future, what we might do is concentrate those on a longer transect, for example, in the habitat that we know that they're actually using. So we'll try to cobble this together over a number of years without having to deploy, many dozens of these ARUs. There's another thing I just want to mention, which is there's a guy named Connor Wood at Cornell who works for this conservation bioacoustics group, who they have hundreds of ARUs out that they use for sampling spotted owls and great gray owls and things like that. And those are recording into the early morning. And he's made available to us a whole bunch of recordings that they've already identified as having evening grosbeaks on them. So we may be able to augment this with additional information from that network of recorders in terms of figuring out habitat associations.
Question?
Yes?
Am I missing it? Did you not put an ARU at Soda Springs?
So we don't have one at Soda Springs right now, but I was going to try to, the road is terrible down to there, and I also hadn't been able to get, I needed to talk to Susan, we need to get permission each time to go down in there, because it's private down there. And so we need to sort that out this year, but we will probably put one at Soda Springs again, but this one at Royal Gorge is only it's a few miles away.
It just doesn't have the carbonate spring.
Well, so we don't know where all these carbonate springs are. We know for sure there are some down at the Cedars, for example, but it would be really interesting to talk to a geohydrologist person and see if there's maps of these things. Yeah, because I think that could be a really interesting aspect of determining distribution of these birds. Yeah. So that's basically where we are right now, and it's stay tuned to see what we get from these ARUs that we just deployed. Those ones, the batteries are going to be done around the end of July, beginning of August, and hopefully we can get back out and visit all of them and put batteries in them again, because the memory cards will last until the fall sometime. I just want to, now we're stuck completely. There we go. So this is just, I want to finish off by just pointing out that this is from this Robinson et al. Paper, where it summarizes where the different types are thought to be as we know them right now, but there's a lot left to be learned, such as movement patterns across seasons. How much is the distributions varying from year to year? What habitats are they most closely associated with? And which of the types are the ones that are the most mobile? It looks like type 1 and 3 are super mobile based on what we know right now. And 4 and 2 are almost never found outside those ranges where or at least not very far, where they're thought to breed. There is some wandering north in type 2s, but in the late summer. But how far do they go, and how much does it vary from year to year? And then what's going on with type 5? There's so few. There's like 5 recordings available total still now. 20 years after we published our original paper, where we had 1 recording. So we need more recordings of type 5. And then there's some really cool stuff happening that Doug Robinson's group is doing, that shows that in the type 3s, the ones up in the Northeast, if you look at old recordings and new recordings, type 3s seem like they've been evolving, have been shifting the structure of their calls in a way that's not apparent in the other types. So that's pretty interesting. And then I also mentioned that in the middle there, in central Canada, there may be yet a 6th call type that we just don't even know about yet, which is one of the cool things about using these audio kinds of approaches, is that you can find what might be cryptic species or taxa that you didn't suspect if you just find different call types. And there are other kinds of birds that have these call types. Evening grosbeaks are one of the ones where we know it's present. Crossbills, we know it's present. Turns out we also know that they're present in purple finches. We have 2 subspecies of purple finches, and we've recently found that they have different calls. Those little short tuck, tuck calls that they do? I don't know if you've ever listened to those. They're extremely inconspicuous and hard to hear. But those things are really hard to tell apart. because they're so short. So harder than crossbills, harder than evening grosbeaks. But they have call types. And we can just learn a lot by getting these recordings and posting them. So remember, don't just record the complicated, fancy, beautiful song. When you're recording stuff, record the calls. Those are the things that we actually use the most in identifying these different taxa. And there's still a ton to be learned, and additional recordings will always be helpful because it will help look for range changes and interannual variation and differences among the types. And I just want to finish by mentioning the people who've done the most on this. So the top right is Kendra Sewell, my graduate student at UC Davis. The next one to the left is Rod Kelsey. They were grad students at the same time. They're the ones who wrote the paper with me back in 2004. This is Matt Young, who's just a complete fanatic about finches and orchids. And in fact, he just came back from some trip he said it's the 2020 one where it's 20 warblers actually and 20 orchids trip that he takes people on. And I need to ask him where this is. It sure looks like Hurricane Ridge to me in the Olympic Peninsula, but I don't know if that's where he is right there. But Matt is an inspiration and is, oops, just banged that thing. And he's relentless about prodding people to do more stuff. He has endless energy. And then this is Doug Robinson and Will Kirsch, the undergrad that worked with him. And then I don't have a picture of one of my former students, Aaron Hahn, who did a bunch of work on the behavior of these birds. But he hasn't published any of that, and I didn't actually talk about any of it, but he did a bunch of work at the Cedars years ago doing behavioral stuff that I'm hoping one of these students will follow up on sometime. And I apologize for going over time. I'll attribute it to endless diversions of myself and also good questions from people, which I appreciate. Just mention, if you haven't looked it up, look up the Finch Research Network, FIRN. It's something that was started by Matt Young, and there's a bunch of stuff about crossbills and evening grosbeaks out there. And I would be happy to take questions if anybody has the stamina to ask them. We can probably turn the lights up at this point so we're not in the dark.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
Do we know why the evening grosbeaks like the carbonate springs?
So, okay, why do evening grosbeaks like the carbonate springs? So all these finches seem to really be fixated on salts. So, for example, one of the great places to find crossbills is around a corral where there's a lot of horse urine that's dried up on the gravel and the dirt. And they come down, they find that, and they eat the grit, and they get salt that way. Seed diets, which a lot of these birds have, are relatively poor in various kinds of salts. There's an old paper from the 1980s by Bennetts and Hutto where they actually did an experiment where they supplemented different kinds of salt solutions onto the ground in the Bitterroot Valley in Montana and showed that the supplemented places, they caught more in traps. They just put little treadle traps down on these salted ground and unsalted ground places. And evening grosbeaks was one of the things they caught more of, and crossbills, cassins, finches, pine siskins, all of those. So they probably like it just because they're short on salts in the diet.
What kind of elevation are we talking about?
Where?
In the Sierra?
For where the birds occur?
The finches, the crossbills in the evenings that you were talking about.
Yeah, so I would say if I were going to look for the most evening grosbeaks, it would be, around 7,000. I mean, it's 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 maybe. There've been a bunch around Tioga Pass down in the south, 10,000 feet this year, but there's supposedly a bunch around Tuolumne Meadows, which is above 9. So that's unusual, though. I think they're typically the most abundant, and crossbills are all over the place, but the evening grosbeaks I feel like are most abundant in sort of the mid-high elevations, especially fir and Jeffrey or ponderosa pine?
They are eruptive though, and I've had them at 3,000 feet at my house.
Yes, but in the summer or in the winter?
It was fall.
Fall, yeah, so how late? Just
It was early fall.
like
September, October.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I've seen big swarms of evening grosbeaks in the Warner Mountains at sort of well, the Warners are kind of high actually, in the fall also. So they're definitely eruptive. Eruptive migrations are these things where they pour out of wherever they are and end up in swarms in other or unusual places. So yeah, they're at a variety of elevations, but I think of evening grosbeaks as typically not super high. So like I'll be curious how many we get in the red fir lodgepole forest, for example. I think there probably won't be as many as...
They were actually going after acorns.
They were going after acorns?
They're big eruption of acorns.
So how are they eating those? Are they tearing them apart? Okay, that's cool. So one of the very weird things about evening grosbeaks is that their food during breeding is something you probably would be surprised by. It's things like budworms. So they're eating insects mainly when they're breeding. And the beak is probably much more for dealing with big, heavy pits of things like choke cherries. They also like the seeds of some kinds of maples. And they also eat lots of fir and pine seeds, which they'll collect off the ground. I've seen them collecting, for example, you know how fir cones just fall apart? So there's like these spikes sticking up with the cone on it. And then when it matures, it just disintegrates and all the seeds fall out. And fir often have those kind of flat branches that are almost like a platter. And these seeds will fall down and be all over those branches. And I've seen evening grosbeaks just picking up fir seeds off of those. And Doug Robinson has seen them in large numbers, for example, in noble fir up on Mary's Peak in Western Oregon. But they also, I think one of the reasons that they've been common down to the south this year is there was a huge Jeffrey pine cone crop this past year. So they probably were eating a lot of the Jeffrey pine seeds that had just fallen to the ground. More questions?
Yeah, about 10 or 15 years ago, there was kind of an eruption here in town.
Yeah.
Couldn't go anywhere without tripping over one.
Right?
And I had heard that they must have been type
One.
in the Rockies.
It's type 1s that, if it's the year I'm thinking of, a bunch of type 1s, the northwestern ones, they showed up even in the Central Valley that year. And they're the more common one down in the Central Valley. In the years when there's an invasion of evening grosbeaks, it's not the type 2s in fact, there's one or two records down like around Sacramento of type 2s. It's almost always type 1s. So they're just much more prone to pouring down here. And this is where having some of these recorder units, for example, or eBird recordings that people post could just be super useful. You have the date, you have the location. Yeah, so anyway, I interrupted you. Were you just curious what was going on with that, or?
Yeah, I had heard, and I'm not sure where, that they were from the Rockies.
So I neglected to say this. To my knowledge, no one has ever observed a type 4 in California. Likewise, no one has ever observed a type 2 in the Rockies. That said, my old friend Marty Morton used to always say, never trust a bird. And so he would have predicted that at some point someone would find one of these in each of these places. But the Rockies could be the northern Rockies, and that type 1 are common in Wyoming, Montana, Alberta, so all the way over into BC. But they're also what I just think of as the northwestern one. They are the prevalent one. For example, I spend a lot of time up on the Olympic Peninsula. That's the one you have up there in Washington. So it could be from the Rockies or it could be from Washington.
The bottom line is they weren't local.
Yeah, they were not they were definitely not the local type 2 birds that we have around, like breeding over at North Star right now. Yes?
I'm wondering about the flight path when they migrate, because when I lived in Nova Scotia, there were a lot of evening grosbeaks, and I just wondered, do they stay in a flight path and they would never go like cross country or?
Okay, so the question is about flight paths of these things. So the Finch Research Network is doing some research on that. Evening grosbeaks are big enough to carry satellite trackers, which crossbills are not, unfortunately. But the question is a really good one, and I don't actually know all of what has come out of that yet. It hasn't been published. But they've been putting these little satellite tags on a bunch of evening grosbeaks, and they've done it with a bunch of the ones in the Northeast. And they're learning a lot about where these birds go. And some of these even have the capability of recharging themselves. They have little solar panel deals on them. And so they're able to actually get a long-term bunch of data from individuals. So your question, I don't have a good answer for you, but I think we will know pretty soon. And they were out this past winter. Matt Young and the other guys on this project were out putting some on birds in Utah, which I believe were type 1 and 4 that they got in Utah, 4 being the southern Rocky Mountain ones. And so hopefully we'll know more before too long. One thing I will say, though, is that unlike crossbills, so for example, I mentioned the smallest crossbills, type 3s. They're the little ones that I encountered in Washington. Those birds are really common along the Pacific coast from like southeast Alaska all the way down to Northern California in the hemlock and spruce forests. In eruption years, they end up in New England, okay? And then they go back. So there will be a year where you have a ton of type 3s in the white spruce in New England, and then they leave the next year. So those birds are a lot of times just moving around in the Pacific Northwest, and then when stuff is really bad, they take off and they go clear across the country. There is no evidence that the evening grosbeaks do this because we're not picking up eastern ones ever in the Rocky Mountains or in California, Washington, Oregon. If they were crossbills, you'd see that sometimes. So they're probably different in terms of being a little more constrained, which is consistent with the whole idea that there actually are subspecies of them with overlap zones, but it's like most of the type 1s are up here and almost no type 2s, and then there's an overlap zone, and then it's almost all type 2s. And then same deal in the northern Rockies, mostly type 1s, and an overlap zone, and then mostly type 4s. So that's just, you can't ever find anything that consistent with crossbills because they are going all over the place using all these different cone crops. Whereas the evening grosbeaks seem a little more tethered to particular geographic locations, even if they're eruptive in the fall and winter.
Thank you.
Yes?
I have a crossbill question.
Okay.
So you were describing different vocal types
Yeah.
that can co-occur
Right.
in the region.
Yeah.
They tend to breed within their own vocal type.
Yes?
Is this sympatric speciation?
Okay, so the question is about possible sympatric speciation in crossbills, and they're actually one of the few examples. Craig Bankman has written a lot about this. He's at Wyoming, University of Wyoming. They are probably, crossbills this is, one of the better examples of something where there is probably, so sympatric means in the same place, living in the same place, and speciation is diverging from among each other while living in the same place. So I think that it's complicated with crossbills because there's periodic allopatry, which is when they're not in the same place, and then sympatry and allopatry and sympatry. But the bottom line is they seem to use these calls, and evening grosbeaks do too, to associate with individuals of like vocal type. And they're probably choosing mates, even if they're not using those flight calls as the mate choice signal. They might use other characteristics too. They are using them to choose flock mates, and that's who they have available to choose for mates. So there are cross type pairs. It's usually, the only one I've ever observed myself it was up on the San Juan Islands, this is crossbills still, where there was a huge Douglas fir cone crop and just thousands of type 4 red crossbills. And there was one female type 2 there. And I happened to find her nest, and she had a mate. And he was a type 4. Well, there were no type 2s around, and there's usually more males than females, so you get some of this, but it's not super, super prevalent. The idea would be, though, that there is selection against hybrids, just like because they would have some intermediate morphology that makes them poor at handling particular cones. But it's kind of a mess in crossbills. It's a nice, messy biology problem. Please also feel free to leave. You are not going to offend me. I teach undergraduates. They sleep through everything.
I just wondered if you could show the first 2 slides again.
Now that it's a little darker, yeah. Let's just zing back through these. Any other questions? Yes.
They're often seen along a roadside, even gravel.
Yeah. So evening grosbeaks and crossbills, actually, and actually one of the things, crossbills just get devastated by people putting salt on roads in the winter because they come down to get the salt and then they get hit by vehicles. So that's something. Evening grosbeaks probably do that too, but they're just not as prevalent as crossbills and it doesn't happen as much. But all of these birds collect grit that they use in their crops and gizzards to help grind up seeds and other stuff that they eat. So that's what that, and in fact, one of the places we were catching lots of crossbills, and there were a lot of evening grosbeaks too, up around Sisters, was in the carport of a person we met in the little town of Camp Sherman. And she had tons of crossbills coming down to her carport and eating the grit there. Yeah, it was really cool.
Did you say that evening grosbeaks are not closely related to black-headed grosbeaks?
Evening grosbeaks and black-headed grosbeaks are not even in the same family. Okay, they're genetically very distinct. Grosbeak just means big beak, and so there's a bunch of different kinds of things that we're calling grosbeaks colloquially that are not that closely related. They are songbirds, but not super closely related. Any other questions? Yes. Do evening grosbeaks have excitement calls like crossbills? That is a super cool question, and I don't know the answer. They have a vocal repertoire of a bunch of sounds that are really hard to hear because they're not very loud, little chuckles and things like that. I have never heard one giving anything like an excitement call.
Going back to the speciation.
Yeah.
So in terms of have the evening grosbeaks been found to have successful offspring with members of a different type? I guess is like that going to be the distinguishing between like a subspecies classification versus a species classification?
So the question is about the species, sympatric speciation. So there's not enough information to know whether there ever are cross-type pairs of evening grosbeaks. There are a few known for crossbills, but there's so few nests of evening grosbeaks that have been found. And actually, my student Kunshao Duman, who's studying crossbills in Wyoming right now, he found some evening grosbeak nests and pairs that were always same type, either type 1 or type 4. So we actually don't know the answer to that, but your question was getting at, could you get successful offspring? And that would be so there's just sort of viable offspring, and then there's ones that survive, to reproduce and so forth. And that's hard with nomadic birds to follow, but it's a really good question. Maybe with tracking devices, we could actually get some sense of it in the future.
It's like the taxonomic differentiation between these species are based on genetics then, or I guess what's kind of...
Yeah, so with evening grosbeaks, nobody has done anything as thorough as what Jeff Groth did. All we have is Grinnell's 1917 morphology and plumage study, and then us coming along later and others following up and saying, yeah, we got all these types, and they seem to correspond geographically with Grinnell's with Grinnell's subspecies, but nobody's done any genetics yet. Yeah, in fact, there's only a little bit of morphology work done. Grinnell did some, and my student Aaron Heyman did a little bit, and there were differences between like female type 4s and 1s or something. I can't even remember now in bill morphology. But your questions are great, but the answers are unknown at this time. Lots of new discoveries remaining. Thanks for coming.
I saw a reference that said that evening grosbeaks have the greatest decline in their population of any land bird
In North America. Yeah, they've declined enormously. Oh yeah, so the decline of evening grosbeaks, you asked about the decline of evening grosbeaks in population, and it's, in particular, Doug Robinson wrote a paper where they used old census data from the Willamette Valley, and there's been a gigantic decline in the number of evening grosbeaks that they have on the Corvallis campus in the spring. It used to be there were so many that people had to use umbrellas because they would get crapped upon by evening grosbeaks. Yeah, so one of the problems with any of these kinds of data is that nomadic birds are very hard to census. And a lot of these birds form loose colonies, so there will be lots of habitat that's appropriate, but that doesn't have any in it. So I don't know quite what to make of the estimates of them having declined as much as they say. I think it's possible. So the other thing is, one of the reasons I think that the data on numbers in around Corvallis, for example, might need to be looked at with some skepticism, not skepticism, but caution, is just that it used to be people weren't feeding birds as much. And the birds would congregate in places like there's elms all over the campus at the Oregon State University, and the evening grosbeaks like certain things on the elms, the buds and all this different stuff. So if there were lots of feeders, one of the things they do is congregate at feeders during the spring when they're staging to leave on migration to go to their breeding places. If instead of now all congregating where there's a bunch of elms, they're scattered all out at a bunch of feeders all over Oregon, it could seem like there's a lot fewer of them because there's fewer at this one place where there used to be a lot, but there still could be a lot. Now, I'm not saying they haven't declined. I'm just not sure I know for sure that they've declined as much as people have said. That said, they're, in the east, for example, they spray forests for budworms, and budworms are critical to evening grosbeak foraging for breeding. So there are things that we're doing that probably are not good for evening grosbeaks. So, yeah. But there's a great paper, Doug Robinson's paper on decline of evening grosbeaks is a good one. He reviews all this. He says what he thinks and argues that there's been this enormous decline, but then he has caveats all in the discussion if you want to see, what he has to say about it.